Whether you want to sell your med spa tomorrow, next year, or 10 years from now, it's never too early to start planning, because it could mean the difference between walking away with zero, millions, or everything in between. That's why I'm so excited to have guests Michael Byrd and BirdAdatto from BirdAdatto Law Firm sharing with us how to scale your med spa to ultimately sell. Welcome, guys. So glad to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's dive right in. Now, if you've been in the med spa industry for any time whatsoever, you've likely heard of BirdAdatto before, because they are leaders in the space. So I want to skip over all the intros and dive right into the good stuff. Does that sound good with you guys?
Yeah, perfect. Great.
Okay, great. So what is it that you believe really is the key considerations buyers are looking for when they want to buy a med spa?
Well, I can start. So because it'll sound like a BirdAdatto plug when I say this, but we believe one of the biggest things they're looking at is compliance. And what we gave us the confidence to lead with that is actually a private equity symposium that we went to in Las Vegas a few months ago. And Brad, I don't know if you want to talk about that.
We had 3 different private equity firms up there for an hour, which we helped moderate. And over that hour, over and over again, when it came to what are they looking for, so they're the big dogs looking to buy stuff, compliance kept coming up over and over again. And their biggest concerns, if things weren't going right, was compliance. So from the beginning to the end of that hour-long panel was all about, that was their number one thing they looked at.
Wow. Okay. So buyers are very risk averse. And so they want to make sure that they're not step into any trouble. And so what are some common steps or a few important things that you can't miss when it comes to compliance?
Well, I can start. Yeah, because we call it like the 3-legged stool. And really, when we're speaking on this for startup med spas, we're like, this is the foundation of what you need to do to stay out of trouble. So this is not getting called before your regulatory board for how you're set up. It just so happens that buyers also care a lot about this. And so there's another incentive, a financial incentive to doing it right on the front end. So the 3-legged stool, I'll start on the first one and let you chime in, Brad, is ownership. Who can own a medical spa? And really, before we dive too far into this, the reason this matters is that most services provided in a medical spa are medical services. And if a business is providing medical services, it's regulated in that way. Many states have laws called the Corporate Practice of Medicine that says if you're providing medical services as a business, you have to be owned by a doctor or a doctor plus, others, depending on the state. I don't know if you want
to. And to add on to that, it's important is often you'll find out, and your audience probably is saying this already, is, well, we're just providing really non-invasive services, and therefore it must be okay because, gosh, Michael, everyone's doing it this way, so it must be okay, right? And that's we have this call, weekly with someone saying, well, everyone is doing it this way, so it must be fine. And so they need to understand just because everyone's doing it the way does not mean it's compliant. And that if you're a med spa, you're falling into the medical community and you have to abide by certain rules.
Yeah, and the solution around that is common. This is how private equity is pouring into the space. It's called the Management Services Organization model, or the MSO model. And essentially, at a very high level, the ingredients of an MSO model are a professional entity that's properly owned according to that state law. So it may be 100% owned by a supervising physician. An MSO entity, which is the business, whatever, the med spa owners, the entrepreneurs that are taking the risk, they're in the MSO. And then that model is brought to life through a contract called a management services agreement. And the MSA broadly does 2 things. One, it sets boundaries from a regulatory perspective. It says anything patient care is going to happen in the professional entity. The business functions are being outsourced to the MSO. We're all going to stay in our lanes. So if the regulators come down, you can point and say, no, our MSO is not getting involved in patient care. We're just doing business stuff. And then the second broad thing that it does is makes the economics of the arrangement work. So whatever the business risk takers, the owners are doing, and when they bring a doctor in, they will have some sort of arrangement they're trying to build. And there is a compliant way to incorporate that into the management services agreement so that you're still staying compliant.
Yeah, and to give your audience a little context is, this is very state driven. So, if your audience member sitting in Ohio, they've like, I've never heard of it. That would be because in Ohio, they don't have a corporate practice medicine law like that. While if you're in New York or Texas or California, they're gonna be very familiar with that because there are laws in those states that have limitations of non-physicians and what they can own on the medical side. So it really is a state-driven conversation. So if this is the first time one of your audience members hearing it, don't panic just because you haven't heard it before. You could be in a state where I think there's 22, 23 states that have some watered down version where non-physicians can have some type of ownership.
Yeah.
And so that,
when it comes to compliance, it's really interesting because I find med spa owners either wait. So they say they do the quick and dirty method at first, right? And then they either wait until there's a problem and then it's like, oh crap, I better get my client compliance together. Or they wait until they have maybe a potential buyer or want to think about starting to buy and then realize like, I did not set this up properly in the first place.
Yeah. And I would add, so that's on those two different fact patterns, the ones in which they just never set up correctly and then they have the problem, those problems can shut you down. And so that's what some people don't realize is they're like, well, what's the worst thing that can happen? I'm like, well, your best day in front of a medical board is a cease and desist letter where you're closing your business until you can make it compliant. So now, not only is you have to like maybe potentially furlough employees, but you can't do anything until you're set up correctly. And now you also have the, a spotlight on you. So that's a bad situation and just got worse because now your business has been shut down. On the other side, we've been a part of deals where the buyer, and just to let your audience know, is especially in the private equity side, they have a bunch of money sitting in the sidelines. They have to close a bunch of deals in a given year. They call it the dry powder has to be deployed, right? That's the way it works. So they show up and Michael's med spa is non-compliant, which it probably would be audience member. But Brad's med spa is perfect. It's beautiful. They listened to this awesome attorney named Brad who put it together nice and clean, right? Well, now they have two choices in front of them. Guess what they're going to choose? If everything else is equal, they're going to go with the easiest one so they can get the deal done faster versus there's some unquantifiable issues with, Michael's med spa. And they're like, well, yeah, they could clean it up, but I got another one right here. Let's go with that one. So that's the other thing we tell them is, yes, you can always clean it up, but it's going to delay the deal. And right now, private equity is moving fast, and buyers just in general are moving fast, trying to get these deals closed.
Mm. Now, you keep mentioning private equity. How does one get in contact with someone to be able to present their med spa if that's what they're interested in?
Yeah, so there's kind of several phases that go into that process. One of which is getting your house in order and ready to sell. There's a whole conversation you could have around that. And then the second is using the selling your home analogy is finding an agent. They're not called agents in this world. Sometimes they're called investment bankers or some sort of representative to advise you on how to get your house ready to optimize your house for sale. And usually it's financially focused at that point, and then to take your business to market. What happens is kind of going on what Brad was just saying, so commonly right now with a crazy market is that sellers are getting unsolicited offers. They're just living their life, and all of a sudden someone knocks on their door because of an introduction or whatever. And though it is flattering and sometimes super tempting, it's like someone walking in to buy your house, when you haven't done it, everything's messy and you're going to pay a penalty. You're not going to get the same price as if you got it together and even got a bidding war going to have others interested in buying.
Yeah. And go ahead.
So let's get back then into getting your house and ready in order, so you're ready for when that opportunity presents itself. So what is the second major key thing that they're looking for?
This is what we call the Med Spa Widowmaker. This actually can get you in really big trouble. It's called the good faith exam. Actually, technically, that's what it's called in California, and was kind of been adopted by the industry as the term of art across the country. But it's essentially this: when a new patient comes in the door of a medical spa to receive a medical service, they have to receive a diagnosis and a treatment plan. Someone with the right scope of practice has to take the patient history, has to look at them and determine that whatever the procedure is appropriate for them. And the trap is, in this industry, most of the people that are providing the services do not have that scope of practice to make a diagnosis. You're talking about doctors, nurse practitioners, and PAs are the ones that have to do that initial exam or that diagnosis.
Yeah, it's in their scope. And so the pushback we often get again on this area is that, well, again, everyone's doing it, and a lot of RNs are like, well, Brad, or Michael, you don't understand. I've been trained. I know how to do this. I can do the injections better than anyone else. And there's no discounting that. But if you go look at a typical RN scope of practice, it's limited in the sense that they don't have independent medical decision-making capability. Nurse practitioners have that. PAs have that. Physicians have that. And so that's that wall that, again, because we're the medical side, this is not a spa treatment. And even though it's elective, meaning the person says, hey, I'd love to get a filler, I'd love to get some Botox, or whatever it is, because it falls in that medical world, someone has to make sure, is that person a good candidate for those services? And that's where that good faith exam or initial medical consult comes into play.
And we call it the Widowmaker because it's so easy to get caught. Because the reason med spas get in trouble is usually patients turning them in. Well, a patient knows who they saw. They know if they went in their first encounter, if they saw a nurse practitioner, a PA, or a doctor, and they're going to turn them in if something goes wrong in particular. And there's really, you're at a difficult position to defend yourself. And the stakes get really high, of course, if someone's been hurt. That's what the boards really care about, is patient safety. And so your range is anywhere from a hand slap and fix it to the scenarios Brad was talking about earlier, where you're shut down until you're doing things correctly.
Yeah, and I will add this to those listening who this is the first time they're hearing this. This is in every state, and so some of our background, not to get too into details, we've been handling medical board, nursing board investigations for years. And the nursing board really cares when an RN is making medical decision making. The medical board really cares when a patient gets pushed through and never seen a doctor before treatments, even though, again, they're non-invasive. So this is why it's a huge highlight for the practices, because they don't realize how important that is. And yes, telemedicine is a huge aspect of a good med spa because of that. That doesn't mean that the physician always has to be there to clear in person. Again, very state driven. But Michael and I have been talking about telemedicine probably over a decade. No one really cared about, and this little thing called COVID came along, and everyone wanted to learn more about this telemedicine thing.
Yeah. Okay. So what you're saying is then you really need a tight process and SOP outlining to make sure your entire team is practicing within their scope.
Yes, and this good faith exam prong really boils down to, do you have a nurse practitioner, a PA, or a doctor involved at the first stage of a new patient, exam and diagnosis? And then actually you just dovetailed into the third, which is the treatment part, and that's the supervision and delegation for those treatments, because now in most states it's going to be an RN, and sometimes in some states estheticians or other providers that are actually treating the patients. And you need to have these written protocols in place, signed off on by the supervising physician, or in some cases nurse practitioner, that says, here is how we do each of these procedures. And then of course each state is different on who can do what. And so you have some states that have rules that are very strict on the formal education you need. So in California, it doesn't matter how good you are, you have to formally be an RN or higher to do a medical treatment. In other states, the formal education is less important, but having the skill set and the training to do them becomes paramount.
Yeah. And to add on to that, it gets real confusing because you'll have states like Florida where the medical board and the rules say the physician can delegate it to basically anyone they believe can do it. But then the nursing board in Florida said, no, we don't think RNs can do fillers and Botox. It's not within their scope. So you have these conflicts of law, conflicts of medical boards and nursing boards, and sometimes the estheticians have different rules. So that's where it gets really difficult because someone's like, well, my friend Sally can do this in Arizona. Why can't I? It's like, well, that's your state law that's driving you.
So if you had to wrap it all up and simplify what does being compliant mean in its simplest way, it's proper ownership and proper staffing. And that's what the PEs are going to be looking at if they're looking to buy, and making sure that those things are in order.
Yeah, and even, for the audience that's not ready even to sell, that's just proper running of your business in this space. And whether you like it or not, the moment you have a spa and you add med to it, it falls into the medical world.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, yeah. So if staying out of trouble wasn't a good enough reason for you to be compliant and get your infrastructure in place, then maybe dangling the carrot of ultimately wanting to sell one day will be a second reason that helps, bring you to the light, let's say. So, all right, awesome. So what is the third thing that people, that buyers are going to be looking for?
The third is the making sure the right people are doing the treatment. So that's the who is actually performing the Botox or the filler or whatever the medical treatment is. And that's where I was going with the, it's very state by state on who can do what. But each state has some element of formal education that's required and some element of proper training for the procedures that are required.
And all of this, obviously, the first, this all fall under the compliance issues that we see, because all three of those are so important.
Yeah. And also, I see a lot too of med spas not being kind of handcuffed by like one service provider, right? So that's from not only like a compliance standpoint, but also like what happened, if you're the owner and you're that one person and you think you're going to have an exit plan and all your patients are going to leave or go somewhere else, or maybe you're not the provider, but they have risk of, them starting up their own med spa. So this is where I talk a lot about with people of really being, systems-based, philosophy driven to be able to duplicate yourself. If you're that service provider, that this prevents you from having that A team and then the C team that sucks and you complain about all the time, and you're just like, oh, if just all my patients could see Sally or that could see me, we'd be doing so much better, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. And a lot of times what people don't realize is the question is, are you an enterprise, in the sense that people come to the building and they go there for the expectation of the services. So it's the whole McDonald's model versus they just come in for an individual. And so from a growth perspective, building the enterprise, as you were describing, is obviously where the value is built. Not that individuals aren't important, but the more, if someone's coming along to buy it, the more they can see that this is something that's repeatable and that you have the staffing in place and it's not just you, it's the whole aspect of it. That has a much higher value than just a person, that they only go to see that person.
And going on what you said earlier, if doing it that way wasn't enough just to kind of, minimize your risk for your day-to-day operations, private equity is looking at your staffing and what are the risks. If they will quickly identify who your A team is and your C team is, and then they're going to look at what's the risk when we buy this of this A person leaving, and that's going to affect the valuation if they're not locked in, either from a carrot or stick approach. So the stick might be non-competes in their employment agreement, or carrot approaches they have, some sort of, financial incentive or even minority ownership or something like that that makes them kind of aligned with the business owners.
Yeah. And again, Michael said the evil word called non-compete, very state driven again, where states like California, non-competes are unenforceable by law, and other states they're allowed. They just have to be, there's a lot of rules to make sure that they're done correctly.
Now you keep using the phrase growth strategy. Give me your philosophy on some of the key elements when developing a med spa's growth strategy that buyers are going to be looking at.
Well, so let again understand that our perspective is coming through the legal lens, and so what we see and how we see them affected. So when you scale, it takes money to do so, and you have several options on how you can do that. You can either self-fund, which means you're reinvesting profits back into the growth of the business, and that can be fine. It's just important to get with your tax advisors to make sure that you have everything buttoned up from a tax perspective, because you're still going to get taxed on your profits that are coming in. And if you're investing in things that are not deductible, you could have some big tax bills that come even though you don't have any cash because you've deployed it all to your scale.
Yeah, and that's a good important part for the audience is to select, depending what you select between being a partnership or a C Corp, an S Corp, or a disregard entity, all tax terminology, that's going to help drive this conversation. What Michael was saying is to that self-funding and the potential tax impact it will have.
And so that's probably attractive to private equity as long as they can understand that story, because the P&L or the financials are not going to look very pretty on the surface because you're taking profits and pouring it back into the business.
Mm-hmm.
But they're sophisticated enough that they can figure out, they have add backs to get to the true value. A second way you can scale is through debt. That may be commercial debt. You, on a positive side, you're not giving up any equity in your business. You now have to deal with what are the risks and things that could affect things down the line. Number one, you're pledging your assets almost always.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, you may be signing personal guarantees, and any of the owners typically that own 20% or more of the business are going to be asked to sign personal guarantees on lines of credit and those types of debt instruments. And then in a private equity exit, they typically are going to require that debt to be paid off as part of the deal. So if you've borrowed $3 million and they're paying $5 million, you're really playing with $2 million in real cash. So it becomes important at that phase to really understand what your cash situation is going to be post close. The third of the four kind of ways to scale is through what we call a joint venture model. And that's where you say, okay, we've got our mothership store that we've built and proven, and now we want to go deploy this at another location. And we're going to go get someone with money to go in on it with us and form a new entity, and they fund the equity. You bring kind of the infrastructure and you work out whatever the deal is, and you kind of scale that way. And so that's, you're not borrowing money, you're not giving up equity in the mothership, you are diluted on each location. And so that can be quite effective. It does get complicated because you start having multiple entities with different owners potentially. And then the final way, and I'll let Brad touch on this, is to get the cash to scale is to go raise money from investors.
And the one thing I want to say that as Michael was kind of walking through all those different options is we always recommend our client be very careful before they give up equity, whether it's in kind or someone's buying in, because once you give that up, it's really hard to get it back. And so while Michael was walking through these different ways, one of the ways that some of our investors is they couldn't go the private route, or they couldn't get the commercial loan they needed, or they didn't go the scaling route that Michael has talked about. They just need investors now to come in. And that's often the case is where it's a lot of times people might have heard the terms of private offering. They might have heard terms like private placement memorandums, where you're saying, hey, I'd like you to come in and buy into my idea of this med spa so that we can grow it. In Michael's example, buying into the mothership itself where we need cash, and I'm willing to give up equity for that cash. Much like everything else we've talked about today, when someone's buying in, even though they're going to help want to grow it, you're going to have to, I call it, you're going to have to disclose the good, bad, and indifferent about how you're doing as a business. So if Michael's going to come in and give you his $5 to buy in, he's going to know, where's that $5 to? How much ownership do I get for that $5? And then how do you look on a day-to-day basis of how you're running your business? Often I call that, this is when you go sell anytime, whether or not it's private equity or you're trying to get private investors in. You're going to have to open up your underwear drawer and show them how the things look. And so hopefully, since when we started this whole conversation, it was be compliant and have a good books and records and everything else. So when you bring in those investors, they will see that you are set up correctly. And then you then get to determine what type of investors do I want to bring in. Do I want to bring in someone who has a preferred return, meaning that they get something a little extra, or they just come in as a common owner, just like me, they don't get anything extra? Do they get to come in because when they come in, they're going to have control over the business? So sometimes you're bringing in that key element of that person you really want, and so they'll sit up on the board with you. All of these are the things that you get to do and decide with your business as you decide to bring in whoever that investor is, whoever that private investor is. Sometimes it's one person, sometimes it's 50 or 60 people. And so we want to make sure that as you bring these people in, understand we've been talking about healthcare law. There's a whole security world out there, and it's called Reg D law that's out there. When you bring in private investors, so you have to be very careful about filing paperwork correctly with either your state or federal government. I won't bore your audience with the details, but conceptually being, that's the last option. And it's probably, I'm trying to think of, Michael, we see it often enough that it becomes a very hot topic as you've kind of maxed out what you want to take out from a commercial loan, and then bringing on these other investors.
Got it. So, okay. So final question here is, if you, regardless, if I'm looking to sell right away or prepare to sell, or even down the road, I am a strong believer in having that, personal and professional board of directors per se and advisors. So I obviously, if I'm looking to sell, would definitely need an attorney such as yourself, right? That is specifically experienced in my niche, right? Because it's different than if you're, buying and selling a McDonald's or a chiropractic office or whatever business it is, right? So that's an important person to have on my personal or professional board of directors. Who else would I want to gather on that team, would you say?
Well, think of it like this. So we're all small businesses. We run a small business. Every med spa is a small business until they get to this scaled situation. And we're really trying to, as a small business, run it in a way that is run like a big business. Big businesses have all sorts of disciplines within their officers of the organization that are needed, because most people have their superpowers and there's things that they can't do well. But we know that there is a financial discipline, there's a legal discipline, there's this kind of staff HR training discipline. What else, Brad?
Those are the big whammies. I mean, the going back to your question, having your legal, your accounting, your tax, your staffing, all of those, the ones in which people need to surround themselves. And sometimes it's internal, meaning that maybe they have their chief CFO that's part of them, or maybe they're using an external group to help with the CFO piece. Maybe they have a tax attorney. The tax attorney doesn't understand all the moving piece of what happens in a health transaction. So they bring in a healthcare attorney to help look at the healthcare piece. So it really does depend on who you're surrounding. But we agree with surround yourself with individuals that understand your business, and not in just some random people that don't know you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I just want to kind of summarize my big takeaways on my level that I heard from you. Okay. So one is you gotta be compliant. Don't wait until you get in trouble. Don't wait until you're close to thinking about selling. Get your shit together, get compliant.
Love
Okay.
it.
Yes.
Number two, you really have your corporate infrastructure in place, and make sure that everyone is working within their scope, right?
Yep.
And the final one is be strategic and completely think through what your growth strategy is going to be, and be able to, document, verbalize, run through the pros and cons before making that final decision.
Absolutely.
I give you an A+ for good active listening.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, guys, thank you so much for your time today. In fact, you have something that you're going to be giving to everyone listening to this. You have a free ebook on the mergers and acquisitions field guide that I'm going to be sure to link up in the show notes here. So make sure that you check it out, and that you follow Byrd and Adatto. Again, we're going to link up where you can contact them for any follow-up questions. And it is never, never too soon to start planning and getting your really foundational systems in your business in place, whether you want to sell tomorrow or years down the road, because it's going to save you a lot of time, a lot of stress, a lot of tears, and it's going to make you a lot more money in the future. So thank you so much, guys, for joining us here today. And I'll catch you here on the next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.